Welcome back, and thank you all for joining us again. I hope you've all had a chance to grab a drink and stretch your legs. I'll be kicking off this second session by telling you a bit about some of the work we've been involved with at Stockbridge over recent years, specifically looking at cropping with Clover Living Mulches and the findings from these trials. There's no replacement for commercial insight, so I'll be keeping myself brief, and I'll then hand you over to Andrew Manfield, with whom we've worked on a number of Clover Living Mulch work programs. He'll tell you about his experience with implementing Clover Living Mulches on his farm and some of his results from participating in the projects. We heard in the first session about the benefits of using living mulches and plant teams more generally, so I won't spend long recapping this. Suffice to say, species-rich systems can have higher productivity than monocultures and greater resilience to environmental fluctuations. There can be benefits to soil health and fertility, as well as soil structure. As a nitrogen-fixing legume, clover can contribute to nutrition for the crop, reducing the need for nitrogen inputs, which is both an environmental gain and a potential buffer for gross margins. By helping to suppress weeds, pests, and diseases, this again reduces the pressure to apply agrochemical inputs, and the greater diversity of resources also helps to support natural enemies as well as pollinators in the agricultural landscape. This gives not only direct on-farm benefits and biodiversity improvements, but can also help support broader agrobiodiversity policy goals. Although there is potential for important benefits, achieving these at a significant expense to yield or quality is not considered acceptable. Challenges remain in, for example, balancing competition between the crop and the clover. Getting the balance right when knocking the clover back so that your crop establishes and performs well, but so that you still get the benefits of, say, weed suppression is tricky from our experiences. What worked in one year might not be enough or might be too much in the next, depending on the weather. There are still questions, I think, for example, on optimal sowing densities and which varieties work best in combination. Getting good clover establishment too can sometimes be patchy, so something to be said for quality of clover seed itself. And if we've not got the balance quite right, how can we manage either the clover in crop or manage any of those weeds that do get in? For a number of years now, STC has been interested in how precision agriculture and machinery can be used to support economically viable and environmentally beneficial sustainable intensification, which led to our relationship with Andrew at Manterra and a research program looking into strip tillage as a means of supporting establishment into Clover Living Mulches. Early results in 2016 were quite positive. If I can draw your attention to the highlighted cells, these show that strip tillage could play a role in minimizing some of the potential challenges, mitigating reductions, if not improving the outcomes. And this then built into 3 major projects we have been involved in for the past 4 years. Diversify is an EU Horizon 2020 project, the overarching aim of which was to develop a novel system for sustainable food production by optimizing crop species mixtures. It ran over 50 commercial scale trials looking at intercropping and also engaged with commercial farmers in a participatory approach. These farmers conducted over 40 additional trials with support from the project, both scientific and financial, and they looked at intercropping on their own farms and returned the data. True is another Horizon 2020 project aiming to identify the best transition pathways to increase sustainable legume cultivation and consumption across Europe. But the results I want to focus on in this presentation, however, are from a third project that STC has been running in collaboration with Manterra, funded by the Rural Payments Agency. Living Mulches is a 3.5-year project, also coming up to its end now, the aim of which is to validate Clover Living Mulches as viable, achievable, and profitable for arable farmers. We used pat approaches and strip tillage to try and overcome some of the restrictions and challenges that are often reported as preventing commercial uptake. We've run validation trials across 3 years at both STC and Manterra. And I'm going to primarily focus on the STC and sampling point driven data to set the scene, as Andrew will be discussing the findings from a commercial perspective shortly. The STC site covers slightly more than 3 hectares, with just over 2.5 of these grown with a white clover living mulch. We have been using spring barley as the main crop and have adopted a low input approach in terms of nitrogen addition. We applied the equivalent of 80 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare once each year across the entire field early in the growing season, just to give the barley a kick start before the clover might be expected to be fixing anything back into the soil. Prior to strip tilling and drilling, every year we knocked the clover back with a low rate glyphosate application, but have otherwise tried to minimize other inputs. We used the Crop Health and Plant Protection Agri-Tech Innovation Centre's Birchie strip till to till into the clover, which itself had been broadcast sown at the start of the project, and then drilled into the prepared seed bed before rolling. I'm not expecting you to read everything on this slide, nor am I going to present all of these. It's just here to give you a rough flavor of the sort of measures we took over the course of the entire project. The interim reports are currently available, and we're working on the final report at the moment. So if you do want more details, do get in touch with me and I can forward these outputs on to you. Right, let's actually run through some of our findings and conclusions. First off, broadly, strip tillage can help mitigate penalties on crop germination and establishment when growing in a clover living mulch. That said, the pattern is not consistent year on year, with some years returning reduced plant counts and others increased plant counts. This seems to hold true across sites, and it could be due to any of a number of things. Likely explanations include, as examples only, age and competitiveness of the clover living mulch, water availability in a given year, and timing of drilling. It is also true that not all crops are equal in terms of their response. The new graph, which has just popped up with the grey bars, comes from our Diversify trials. And you can see here that spring oats germinated and established well in both well-established and newly sown clover mulches after strip tillage. This might be because of allelopathic effects from the oats themselves, and that might give this particular crop a bit of an edge in fighting back against the clover competition. What did we see in terms of yield? As a bit of context, these figures are based on hand-collected and threshed harvest from quadrats at each sampling point, dried out in an oven and then extrapolated up to tons per hectare. On the STC validation site, we observed higher yields in terms of both grain and straw dry weights across all 3 years, from crop grown with a clover living mulch, when we compared this to the crop grown without the clover. Even if overall yields, I think, were below the national average, this was quite an encouraging result. It is worth noting, however, that at Manterra, where no dry nitrogen was added and clover was very well established, yields were instead reduced. I've shown grain yield here as indicative, but straw followed a similar trend. We've seen similar patterns in other trials, both in Diversify and True, and unsurprisingly, this seems linked with germination and establishment success. Where the crop got away well and the clover didn't compete with it as strongly early in the season, there were yield gains with strip tillage. And much as before, oats seemed to do really well, strip tilled into the clover. I'd mentioned earlier the importance of balancing the clover management to sufficiently stress the clover such that the crop can get away, and these next graphs are intended to illustrate the point. Just to set a bit of context again, the areas without understory were at these points receiving herbicide applications, and this accounts for the low weed pressure there. I've highlighted in the boxes the bars I want to draw your attention to. This data is from 2019. Come April, May, we'd expect about 50% clover cover given strip tilling to drill, with recovery of clover through the season. The take home here is that in 2019, conditions at STC weren't great for clover recovery, and we knocked it back too hard. You can see that by July, the clover had deteriorated and weeds were encroaching considerably. The Manterra clover, by contrast, showed excellent recovery following strip tilling and drilling, and no or very few weeds, or at least comparable to the standard monoculture, albeit at cost to yield. A final brief slide. There are positive indicators in terms of pest suppression. You can see here reduced aphid numbers and increased natural enemy and pollinator numbers. I've not shown the data here, but there are good indications for disease suppression too. But it's not always good news here either. Slightly higher numbers of slugs were recovered in traps in clover living mulches, as would be expected, certainly when compared to those in the control areas without clover. So to conclude, strip-tilled clover mulches can deliver benefits, including the potential to increase yields. It is possible to maintain yields at or sometimes above conventional cropping practices, but this is very tricky. Good clover management is critical. There are still questions to answer to optimize clover living mulch systems, especially in conventional approaches. All that leaves is for me to thank you for listening. I'll happily answer any questions you might have. And again, do feel free to get in touch if you want more details at a later date. Well, seeing as asking myself my own questions would be enormously self-serving, if I could invite anybody who has any questions to put them forward, I'd be grateful. Stunned silence. Okay. Do you think the slugs kept to the clover? I wouldn't say that they strictly kept to the clover, but there were certainly higher numbers within the clover plots. It is also worth saying that we did see higher carabid numbers in the traps themselves, and carabids are predators of slugs. So I haven't looked at this correlation particularly closely yet, but it might not be as bad as it seems, I think. Anybody else? Did the clover climb the barley crop more than the oats? We used white clover in both. We used the same sort of white clover in both. So I'd say they probably climbed about the same. The oats ended up growing a bit taller, so they got away from the clover at the end to a greater extent. But I wouldn't say that it made a huge amount of difference in our particular trials. I have another one. Did you have any counts for the earthworms? Yes, we did count earthworms. To be honest, I don't think the clover performed as well as we'd been hoping for the earthworms. We did see higher numbers. However, it is also important to note that we took about maybe 20 centimeters of the soil as a core when we did the earthworm counts. So the number of earthworms you might be expected to catch in that amount of soil would be quite limited anyway. I think future work would be useful to look at a deeper soil profile and maybe be more specific about the sorts of worms we were looking for. Did you have any issues at harvest with the clover in the bottom? So the question is, did you have any issues at harvest with the clover in the bottom? I don't think we had too much trouble, to be honest. The clover stayed pretty low and we were able to set the combine teeth slightly higher. I think I might defer that question in full to Andrew, who is following up on this presentation. He'll be looking at the commercial aspects of using clover on his farm. So he's probably really well placed to answer that question. Anything else? If not, I think that will be an excellent opportunity to move on to Andrew. So I will hand over to Andrew now. Let me see.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Manfield, and this afternoon I hope to firstly give you a little bit of background into who I am and where I farm. then look at the motivation for getting involved in this project, a little bit of information about the practice of what we did, and then a discussion of the challenges that we had and that we faced. We farm what I would call a fairly typical family farm with mixed cropping, winter wheat, malting barley. Our biggest single enterprise has certainly been certified seed potatoes, although that's pretty challenging profitability wise at the moment. Vining peas for bird's eye, oilseed rape, and a little bit of rotational grass that traditionally would have been used as part of a ration for fattening some cattle, but at the moment we don't have any livestock on the farm. We, as I say, farm a very shallow soil over a chalk aquifer. Therefore, we have difficulty maintaining any nutritional indices due to a lack of soil volume. Leaching is a problem, and we know this very clearly from the rising nitrate content of the water that we use, that we consume within our own houses from our borehole. So we pull our water directly from the aquifer, and it's tested regularly by the council as per the regulations. So, we've a clear indicator that our nitrogen use efficiency isn't as good as it could be. We know that the best way to improve that is by improving organic matter. Much as we would like to use organic manures, it doesn't just fit our business at the moment for a variety of reasons to do with staffing and other matters. So that led us to look at how we could improve our cropping regime to try to make matters better, which of course led us to look at cover crops. Now, we do have some issues with cover. These two slides will illustrate in some way. So I've taken some climate figures for High Mowthorpe, which is very similar situation to our farm on the Wolds, and just for the purposes of illustration, a location near Maidstone in Kent. And I think the differences are quite marked. So I draw your attention to the difference in average temperature of almost 3 degrees, which is very significant. It's a lot warmer in Kent, further south. And also we get considerably more rainfall. So that those two things may seem sort of fairly obvious in themselves, but they have a really big impact on the window of opportunity for establishing cover crops, and also the likelihood of those cover crops achieving significant volume in terms of the organic matter they can provide. So essentially our problem is that the opportunity to establish what might be traditional cover crops arrives too late in the season, and by then it's too cold for them to achieve significant volumes. So this got me to thinking about how we could make a different approach whereby we could get a kind of multi-annual cover crop. To the idea of a multi-annual white clover intercrop, and this was also born out of our interest in work with strip tillage machinery. So this seemed to offer an immediate opportunity for us to put two crops side by side, and working with the people at STC, that kind of encouraged me in this idea that we could do this. The obvious place to start was with a relatively uncompetitive legume like white clover, with a crop that we knew would thrive in relatively wide rows, indeed arguably is optimized in wider rows, and that's winter oilseed rape. So winter oilseed rape gave us the opportunity to establish our clover alongside the rape at an optimal time with us for both crops of early August. So the early August window for sowing rape does seem to improve our chances of getting it away from flea beetle. I can't really make any meaningful comments about whether having an intercrop alongside the oilseed rape reduces flea beetle damage. I just think that's very hard to get a really firm grip on. But we do know that because we're putting the oilseed rape in wide rows, we are getting plenty of light to the clover. The clover's going in a window where it has time to thrive, and we can get a decent establishment of clover in the autumn. To the extent where, when we took the oilseed rape crop off, very quickly the white clover would spring back and we would have clover flowering in no time at all. Now, I would say that was quite a considerable success, has quite a lot of potential. The two crops complement each other. Subsequent work with cereals into that platform, however, has established that there are some challenges, and I think it's important to go through those and look at what we have learnt and what we could perhaps do differently in future. So, although on the whole the clover establishment was pretty good, and the nature of that initial crop with the oilseed rape did give the clover a chance to establish well on the whole, I would not say that the clover establishment was 100% by any stretch of the imagination. Now, to some extent, that may have been that we should have had a different variety. Obviously, there's a considerable difference in vigour between different clovers, although I don't think there's that much good information available on the different varieties. And then we also were led to wonder a little bit as to what was the quality germination percentage of the clover seed we were getting. Is it as consistent as the kind of certified seed that we would be used to? The other issue which we found was regarding weed control. On a positive note, we found that the clover was very resilient. It would withstand quite a hard time and still come back eventually. And the fact that you could put Avadex on it, the fact that you could put Starane on it, or Fluoxipor and other chemicals, and you would knock it back and it would still come back, and even glyphosate to some degree is a real bonus in terms of having the flexibility to manage particularly cereal crops. Indeed, it is possible to use those non-clover approved safe, but actually chemicals that the clover will tolerate, in order to manage the canopy, the clover canopy that is, because obviously there is potentially an issue of competition between the clover and the cash crop, which I'll return to in a moment. Clover competition is also critical in terms of competition with weeds, because if you choose to structure the crop in such a way that some of the control of the weed burden is dependent upon having good clover establishment, because you're intercropping in the sense that you're creating zones where there's a bit more clover and zones where there's more cash crop, then it's critical that you do have clover where light is getting down to the floor of the crop canopy, because without the clover, then obviously the weeds can thrive more readily. And this is where the issue about getting good clover establishment becomes quite critical. And certainly where we were seeing more weed because we weren't getting the clover establishment that we wanted, it did lead us to look at changing our technique for establishing the following cereal crop. So whereas we would perhaps in the first instance have strip tilled and put cereals in strips, in lanes if you like, in a subsequent year we actually just drilled cereals in overall and sort of slightly changed our approach to it, and we on the whole felt that was more successful. So the ratio of clover to cash crop changed, if you like. And this optimization of the crop structure is, I think, really key. And I think it does require some flexibility, because you've got to bear in mind, in our experience, that you've got two crops essentially competing for resources potentially. You've got your cash crop and you've got your intercrop. And you've got to manage that balance with care. And again, we found where we were allowing too much light to penetrate through the canopy of the cash crop later in the season, the clover would compete too strongly for resources with the cash crop, the cereal crop in this case. As I say, it wasn't really an issue with the oilseed rape crop, but with cereal crops we found it could be an issue. And it's a problem accentuated by the fact that we seem to be increasingly getting these long dry periods, and particularly if it was dry, the water was a scarce resource. Now, obviously, the intention is to build organic matter and to try and alleviate these problems to some extent through soil quality as time goes on, but it needs to be borne in mind. And really that is what leads me to the point which I think when you set out with this, you need to have clear objectives in mind and manage the crops accordingly. And we found that we had to be more flexible than we initially thought in order to achieve which was our clear objective, which was about improving soil quality. So we set out to improve organic matter, and that was our prime aim, more than trying to use the leguminous effects of the clover to supply nitrogen to the companion crop. Because there's no doubt that when we needed to suppress the clover quite hard in order to prevent competition with the cash crop, we probably were reducing the amount of nodulation we were getting from the clover. So that is a trade-off, I guess. I can't put figures on that, but we were undoubtedly doing that. And yet at the same time, obviously, we were getting the benefits that we had this kind of understory, the rooting, the better drainage, and so on and so forth. So I suppose that's my takeaway message really, is you really need to be clear about what you want, because there are conflicts and tensions, and we found that the danger was that we would potentially undermine the profitability of the cash crop by putting too much emphasis on the quantity, if you like, of the understory, the intercrop. And it is a balancing act, which is why we ended up favouring two different establishment techniques according to the crop that we were putting in alongside the clover. The strip tillage for the oilseed rape, but then the more a case of knock the clover back hard, and so overall with the cereal crop, knowing that we could manage the understory then using a range of herbicides and so on that we would need to apply anyway to the cereal crop just for normal weed control. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Always really useful, I think, to get the perspective and insight directly from a farmer. So I'm going to start by handing you the question that was given to me at the end of my presentation. Did you have any issues at harvest with the clover in the bottom?
Excuse me. It is something that you do need to be aware of. We were a bit concerned about this because, as I say, depending on how the clover has been managed within the structure of the growing crop, it can really bounce back very quickly if conditions are suitable, near harvest or at harvest. Because obviously, as the cash crop senesces, the clover does get more light, starts to rebound, if you like. And I was a little bit concerned that we might have some issues on the cutter bar, but it wasn't an issue. It wasn't an issue. Certainly our combine harvester, where there was green material, did seem to go through it pretty well. But yes, you definitely do need to be aware that white clover obviously is a relatively low lying clover. The more aggressive clovers, I think you would need to be aware of how you're managing that and how much light's getting through, because it can bounce back pretty vigorously and pretty quickly in my experience.
Thank you. Are there opportunities to embed PAT to make establishment and management easier?
Sorry, are there opportunities?
To embed precision agriculture technologies to make establishment and management easier?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one thing that I should have mentioned in the presentation. I think, for example, where you've got an issue with clover establishment, and this is at a relatively simple level. If you've got issues with clover establishment, which I think is not uncommon, variable application of seed subsequently using, to patch up the clover would be a really obvious application of variable application technology, because, clover seed is not for nothing. And, we all need to try and control our input costs on these understories. So using variable application technology would be one really good application technique for patching up those clover where you haven't got good establishment. And then obviously, in terms of the strip tillage, that's a much more precision farming dedicated regime, where you're using the RTK to get the repeatability, but that's like another level of commitment, if you like, to the precision farming cause.
Excellent. Has livestock been considered in the rotation?
Yeah, in many ways, we would love to have some cattle in the rotation, particularly. Very keen on cattle as a source of organic material. Just, we have kept cattle, just very, very difficult to make sense of it, not only economically, but also within the sort of labor structure of the farm, because cattle really need, by their very nature, they need sort of 7 days a week, maybe not 24 hours a day, but you're always on with cattle, aren't you, and any livestock. So just quite difficult to make that fit from a practical level, and it's not as though the economics of them are so compelling that that you restructure things accordingly.
Cracking. I think we've got time for one more question. Will you be extending the area you're using with understories? And what barriers might you have to actually doing this?
I think we need to look carefully at the rotation that we're using. I've sort of, two aspects to it, really. One is in terms of the rotation and exactly how we incorporate that. I kind of working towards a position where I could see us using these understories perhaps for 3 years, and then having a fresh start, a refresh, if you like. The second one is we do have an issue, as you might say, with the means of aphid control that we have in our seed potato crops. Our pesticide armory is severely diminished, and there has been quite a lot of work being done in terms of intercropping as a benefit in potatoes for trying to prevent aphid virus transmission in potatoes. So I think that's an area that we're going to be looking at more strongly. So the answer is broadly yes, but perhaps not in the crops that we've been working with so far, other than the oilseed rape.
Fantastic. I see we've had a quick follow-on to the livestock question, which is let the grazing out.
Yeah, my agronomist. Yeah, absolutely. My agronomist says something along those lines. So yeah, very wise comment. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrew. Much appreciated. We will now be handing over to Dominic Amos at the Organic Research Centre to wrap up proceedings before the open questions session. Let's see.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dominic Amos. I work as a crops researcher at the Organic Research Centre. And this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about an innovative farmers field lab that I'm involved in, exploring with a group of farmers the use of clover understory as a living mulch for arable crop production. So if I share my screen with you now. So the presentation today, Living Mulches, a path towards more sustainable cropping systems. So why is it that we want to grow living mulches? Well, there's a number of key benefits. It's about agro-ecosystem services and the delivery of those services. So we're trying to utilize functional biodiversity and complementarity between the clover and the cereal crop, and also to harness ecological intensification. So really it's an extension of undersowing to provide a permanent or semi-permanent understory. And the two main services that the farmers are looking for from the mulch are weed control. So it's going to offer competition against weeds. It's going to hopefully inhibit germination of weeds. And also nitrogen accumulation. So it's a clover, it's a legume. They're looking for biological fixation of nitrogen and hopefully improve nutrient cycling. And looking more from an organic perspective, in order to try to reduce tillage. So two of the key challenges in organic farming are controlling weeds and getting enough nitrogen in the system. Is this a way to potentially help to reduce tillage, to help organic farmers plough less? And we know there are benefits from reducing tillage and improving physical characteristics of the soil, improved structure. Having a permanent clover cover could improve trafficability and farmers' ability to get on the land, extending the season. It's also offering soil protection and a kind of buffer, mitigation against climate extremes in both temperature and moisture. The clover also offers a couple of services as a catch crop to hold on to nutrients over the winter, and also as a green manure, as old biomass dies, decomposes, releasing more nutrients into the system. And finally, also enhances biodiversity and should increase, biodiversity above and below ground. And all that, hopefully, once the system's up and running, should allow the reduction of inputs, both in terms of tillage and chemicals. So a bit more then on the actual innovative farmers trials that are taking place that the farmers are conducting. So as I said, it's about establishing a permanent or semi-permanent clover understory. So we started with 7 trials across 6 farms last spring, in spring 2020. We've selected a particular trial mix. I have to say that's in collaboration with Cotswold Seeds, who have kind of great expertise and knowledge in this area. So they've offered technical advice to help us select the right mix to perform the functions we're looking for without hopefully offering too much competition with the cash crop. And the clover is about using clover is about the functional biodiversity and maximizing that complementarity between the two different plants. So it's about the cereal and the clover are occupying slightly different ecological niches. So resource demand might be slightly different, or their canopy architecture is different, and the root architecture is different too. So hopefully that allows the two to grow together in harmony. So the actual trial mix then, the clover mulch mix that's been used, it's made up in a 70-30 proportion of a small leafed wild white clover, cultivar aberrace, and a small to medium leaf white clover, cultivar aber herald. So those clovers, as I said, they were undersown last spring generally into spring crops. Spring wheat or spring barley, although some winter crops were undersown. But this is really the first season now that the system's up and running. I should say, having started with 7 trials, the very dry conditions last April and May during clover establishment meant actually that 5 of the trials failed to be set up and established successfully. The clover was killed off by the extremely dry conditions for those 2 months. But we do have 3 trials up and running that I'll talk a bit more about now. So to give you an idea of the kind of field monitoring that's taking place, so we assessed clover cover to see how well the mulch had established in its first season. So this was post-harvest in September. You can see, so we're at the farm on the left there, so that's at Mark Lee's up in Shropshire. He had 91% clover cover weighed undersown spring wheat, and 69% clover cover post-harvest weighed undersown winter wheat, which makes sense with the winter wheat, the winter crop, with more biomass offering more competition, for the establishing legume. We also did emergence counts from the direct drillings this autumn. So he's drilled rye into the mulch that was undersown into spring wheat, and oats into the mulch that was undersown into winter wheat. So we found on average across the oats and the rye in the mulch, compared to the controls that we have of standard farm practice, so either ploughed or shallow non-inversion tillage, that there was on average 70% the emergence, crop emergence in the mulch plots. That's already slightly lower. However, we may hope or expect that there will be some sort of compensation for the slightly lower plant populations. And at the time of that plant count assessment in November, the clover was covering on average around 85% of the ground. We also dug some soil pits and did some earthworm counts and found that nearly double the amount of earthworms in the mulch plots compared to the control plots, which you'd expect from the reduced tillage and disturbance of the soil. So on the second farm then, this is at James Alexander's in West Oxfordshire. He undersowed spring barley last spring, and then he direct drilled winter oats into the mulch in October in last year. So post harvest, we found a 48% clover cover in the mulch strip, and we did an assessment comparing the mulch strip and the control, and we found that there were only 33% weed cover within the mulch compared to the control, so a really big reduction there, and one of those key services that the mulch is designed to deliver. From the emergence counts conducted last November, we had 80% emergence from the mulch plots compared to the control, and you can see the pictures there demonstrating that assessment. And the clover is currently on average covering around 90% of the soil. So in terms of a kind of system comparison then, so if we look at the farm trial at James's in Oxfordshire, you can see that left-hand photo, that's the standard farm control. There are 2 strips in the field. That was drilled with a horse sprinter back in mid-October, following ploughing. And you can see the kind of ground cover there from the smaller photo. Then we have two systems that we're comparing. So we've got the oats direct drilled into the clover. That happened about a week after the control plots, and that was using the cross slot drill. We also have a kind of second, more scientific control that is direct drilled without the mulch. So we get only one variable to compare there. We can compare, almost directly, the effect of the mulch, whereas to the farm control, you've got the two variables of reduced tillage and no mulch. So what are the key practical considerations then? I think there are sort of five main considerations when thinking about setting up this kind of system. So the mulch selection, I've already talked about that, looking for that complementarity, looking for those key service provisions without offering too much biomass and competition with the cereal crop, and that really is a trade-off in the system. Time of establishment. So again, we've already touched on that. These were spring established clovers. Actually, the spring last year shows how high risk strategy that may be. In case conditions turn dry, the clovers can really struggle. And it may be, although it hasn't been a part of the field lab so far, although it was discussed in the early stages of potentially trying to establish the clovers post-harvest, very early or late summer, early autumn, perhaps with a more vigorous nurse crop, something like buckwheat, or even with some annual clovers in there, like Berseem clover, to get going quicker, to help the clover establish and hopefully guarantee enough soil moisture for the clover to grow. So in terms of crop selection then, for direct drilling into the pre-established stand of clover, so the two farmers with successfully established clover, they've both chosen winter oats, and Mark's also gone with rye. So they've chosen those as the most competitive crops that they grow. Actually, something like wheat isn't a particularly competitive crop, and for wheat here, I'm talking about kind of modern high yielding variety, but maybe the heritage wheats with more biomass and vigor and more height may be more suited to this system. The other option that's been discussed in the group is also to potentially drill spring crops, but early in the season, so in kind of January. And as I already mentioned, the mulch may improve trafficability, the ability to travel on the land. It may be that drilling an early spring crop could also be a good option. I think the key would be not to drill the spring crop at a standard time when as it establishes its direct competition for resources with the clover. Then crop establishment. So both the successful trials have been direct drilled last autumn, but there's another option around strip tillage. That hasn't been used yet, but it's been discussed as a way to limit the competition from the clover, to keep the clover away from the base of the plant whilst it establishes in that foundation stage, whilst it's trying to grow and develop, and where it may be more vulnerable to competition. Obviously, in setting up a strip till, you're still able to reduce tillage overall across the field. And actually the clover is likely to creep. So the stolons will creep and close in and cover the ground completely, but maybe at a point when that competition between the clover and the cereal is less crucial. And finally, mulch management, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. Whether to mow or graze the mulch, and when the best timing for that might be, in order to reduce competition and try and hand the competitive advantage to the cereal. I'm thinking mainly from an organic perspective, but for conventional farmers, adding mineral nitrogen or using dilute herbicide could be a way of selectively managing the mulch, and again handing that competitive advantage to the cereal. The cereal is going to be better at acquiring the nitrogen, and obviously selective herbicide could knock back the clover and can allow the cereal to continue to grow. So a bit more then on managing the mulch, which actually could be the key to managing the system effectively. So we also know that if you cut or graze the clover, that they'll drop and release carbon and nitrogen from their roots, and that's something that the cereal can benefit from. So it actually could be quite a useful strategy again to promote cash crop growth. I'll talk in a second. I've got a slide coming up about critical weed-free period as well. And as I've already mentioned, for conventional farmers who have mineral nitrogen herbicides as options, that could be a selective way to manage the mulch. And I think the key with grazing or mowing would be that you're not able to selectively manage necessarily. So you'll graze both the clover and the cereal at the same time. So in terms of this critical weed-free period then, this is just referring back to a study a few years back on some organic wheat to show when maybe the most critical period is for weed control and for keeping a developing cereal crop free of competition. And they established this critical period between sort of 500 and 1,000 growing degree days. And that's likely to fall. It obviously depends on the season and on drilling date, but that's likely to fall between November and March. So that could be a time when it's most important to keep that competition from the clover to a minimum. It's another reason why perhaps a strip till rather than direct till approach might be a better compromise. But it's a key period for the crop in terms of its foundation. And in terms of its its growth and development. And one other option that's been discussed within the group is around trying to selectively manage the clover mechanically using an inter-row mower. Now these things don't, I think, exist commercially, but one of the farmers in the group has retro-engineered a weed surfer to try and perform this function, and I know that some agriculture engineers are looking into ways to try and design equipment that may be able to mow the intra-row again, to reduce the biomass of the clover and allow the cereal crop to grow away and hand it the competitive advantage. So the latest update from the trials then, so as I said, there's 3 trials up and running across the 2 farms. Both the oats and the rye have come out of the winter looking well. So this photo was taken just a couple of days ago, and the cereal crops look vigorous and healthy. We'll look to do some sort of biomass assessment of the crop, the weeds, and the mulch, either later this month or perhaps in May, and the farmers will collect and share the grain yield and grain quality data, so we can compare the effects of the mulch and of direct drilling to the farm controls. Should also say the trials that weren't successful last spring, the farmers have been resupplied with seed, and they're going to have another go this spring at establishing the clover, which is going to increase the participation and hopefully the overall knowledge exchange amongst the group. So really, in a nutshell, it's all about this race for biomass. So there's a couple of photos there. One on the left shows a direct drilled control plot of winter oats at the farm in Oxfordshire, and on the right there is same thing but direct drilled into the pre-established stand of clover. You can't see too many differences at the moment. And then those 2 smaller photos on the right there, they were sent to me by Mark a couple of days ago, just showing the establishment of the rye in the control at the top there, and compared to the the mulch plot below. So in summary, it's a new system requiring a systems approach. And once the system's established, it's about managing the interactions between the cash crop and the cover crop. Thinking about the mulch, thinking about the cover crop in terms of a designated weed, we know it's going to offer competition with the crop, and it's about managing that competition. To some degree, there's likely to be a yield penalty, and it's just about trying to manage that as much as possible and limit it. And I think also for any farmers thinking about embarking on this kind of approach and this kind of system, it's about setting your sort of goals and priorities and thinking about what's most important, which would help in your approach to managing the system. So is it about yield or is it about quality or both? Is it about improving margins or about reducing inputs? Perhaps interested in non-chemical weed control. Is soil health more important? Is it about increasing, carbon and organic matter in the soil? So thank you very much for your time. Been a pleasure to talk to you, and yeah, very happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That sounds like a really interesting piece of work happening there with the Innovative Farmers Group. So where shall we start off today?
Can I just say, Jen, because there was one thing watching back through it that I'd missed maybe as a sort of point of clarification. It was around the establishment and the best time to do it. Now, you already mentioned that it might depend, from one season to another in the conditions and the environment, it's context specific, and what does well one year, might not do so well another year. I think what I didn't really mention as well is in establishing the mulch, trying to avoid fields that may have a high grass weeds burden or perennial weed burden is important, for the organic farmers. So I suppose that's what perhaps suggests that the spring cropping might be a more effective time, undersowing a spring crop, so you've got a good lead in to mulch establishment, and good weed control might be a better timing, although it's also risky in terms of the weather, especially if if it turns dry as it did last spring.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
right.
The system's there to maximise that complementarity between a grass and the forage legume, and obviously that includes grass weeds too. So that would be a key. That would be why I think probably spring, understanding the spring crop is a better option.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. We have a message here which says, I have used an inter-row rotavator that worked well. Is this something that the group has considered?
An inter-row rotavator. I think one of the farmers where the trial hasn't successfully established because of the dry spring is looking more at that approach. So of the let's say 3 successful trials we have up and running, they've been just direct drilling straight into the clover. So we haven't yet attempted a kind of that strip till approach, or with a rotavator. But it does look like from what I've heard and seen, and your trials, Jen, and the other trials from Manterra, that strip till might be the best compromise, a better option for organic farming, just to try and reduce that competition during the establishment stage of the crop, because especially without access to mineral nitrogen and herbicides to be able to manage the clover and the competition.
What would you say are some of the keys to success for organic farmers, contrasting, say, to more conventional systems?
Yeah, so I kind of went through them a bit and outlined the key elements, I suppose, to making the system work. I do think it's about the compromise. There are so many trade-offs in the system. The other thing for organic farming maybe is more of an issue than conventional farming is obviously weeds. So there's actually a third dynamic in the mix. Without herbicides or without these tools to be able to manage weeds or selectively manage the clover. It's also about managing your weeds, and potentially, as mentioned, this idea of an inter-row mower. So if the clover is if there's too much biomass, it's offering too much competition, that you could selectively reduce biomass that way, and also feed the soil and the microbes at the same time, and the cash crop. And that would also help you to control weeds, because of course, once you've got the clover growing, organic farmers, they use a harrow comb or interrow hoeing, but that option's not available once you've got the mulch established. There are other mechanical weeding machinery that's designed to weed in established crops. So a comb harrow or a weed surfer, that's normally about controlling weeds that grow above the crop, and cutting the flower heads and the seed heads to stop weed seed dispersal and return. But yeah, it looks like a challenge. And as I say, from the results that you've already presented with the direct drilling approach, although I think the farmers have selected the right crops, the most competitive crops, it's about what that tolerable yield loss is, and we won't know until harvest this year actually what the penalty is. But I guess from some of your results, it could be looking at sort of 60%, 70% of the yield compared to the control. So it's managing those dynamics and trying to limit that yield penalty as much as possible is going to be key.
Before I open the floor for open questions, I have a question that's cogitating over here. Are there any patterns starting to show up across the group? And do you think any patterns which are already showing up might make any optimization suggestions in terms of using Clover Living Mulches?
So again, because actually we only got the two successful trials across two farms. I mean, the main difference I say between the farms is soil type, and also particularly sort of natural soil fertility. So one of the farms is on a sort of shallow clay loam in the Cotswolds, and one's on a lighter land, silty, sandy silt loam. But that farm uses a lot of compost, so there's a lot of fertility in the soil, and the P and the K levels are much higher than the farm in the Cotswolds. And what we observed was that there was a lot more biomass in the clover at the farm using compost, and that makes sense because the clover's hungry for P and for K. So the species selection might be important in that case, and also the management. So if you've got a lot more biomass, that might require grazing off or cutting back in the winter or before drilling your cash crop into the clover. Whereas maybe where you've got lower P indices and less available K in the soil, that you can use maybe a slightly more aggressive clover because it shouldn't put on too much biomass.
Right. And last, super quick one, can anyone get involved with the Innovative Farmers Group?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always open to new participants, either just to join the group to follow and attend meetings and access the portal and find out what's going on that way. We've got a WhatsApp group as well that they can join, or even to look at running an on-farm trial or a farm experiment to participate in that way, to increase the kind of the shared learning and the collective experiment that's going on. So sure, get in touch with me or with the Innovative Farmers Programme. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, Dominic. If I can invite the other panelists into the open questions session. If anybody has any questions they would like to put to the panel, please do put it in the chat or in the Q&A function. I'm going to start with one which was sent in advance of the webinar. Does anybody have any experience with mulching with organic materials? I know we don't have a huge amount of experience with this at STC, so I thought this was a good opportunity to pose the question.
You mean with dead material?
I just have organic material, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think I've come across, I've come across cover crops that have been mulched and left on the soil. I think that was looking at reducing potato blight, but it's not work I've been directly involved with.
Yeah. Andrew, maybe you?
Not work that I've been directly involved with. I mean, again, coming back to the seed potato issue I mentioned earlier, you know, there is work that we will, I think, be getting engaged in that is on those lines, to do with aphid control, but that would be the only kind of work I have any knowledge of. So.
I suppose I've done it, again, no real direct involvement, but some of the work we were doing looking at pest control, not specifically really related to mulches, but we were actually covering the surface of the soil with different coloured, I suppose you could call them organic, it was a sort of waste paper mulch almost, to try to demonstrate, and did demonstrate, that if you use a green mulch, you confuse pest insects. If you use a brown mulch, you don't, because you're not having any impact on how they locate the sort of the crop plants, the host plants that are growing through it. But that's the only experience I've had, and that was quite small scale research trials.
All right. Yeah, it's Neil might have had a little bit more to say. It's a shame he had to pop off, really. Well, let's bring it back to the living mulches and intercropping then. I think an interesting question would be to have a bit of a think about how the current commercial landscape changes the potential for profitability of understories. I don't know whether, I think maybe Emily, Andrew, and perhaps Dominic's experiences might reflect here.
Well, I guess this is a point that Neil did mention earlier on. You know, we are in from the point of view of agricultural support, there's every opportunity that there will be occasions where we can get, hopefully, support for these kind of regimes as part of the new support regime. I think it's all a bit up for grabs at the moment, so there's certainly it's important to make our voice heard on the potential for these, and that would have a significant role to play in the financial viability of these regimes.
Emily, do you have anything you might want to add on?
Just to agree with it, really, that as on top of that is a better understanding for the public as well of what we're doing in this kind of like area, so they know what the money's going into, because at the end of the day it's public money which will be going into it. So it's learning with them. So I know through projects and through Leaf Education, we're trying to like educate schools as young people as well as the wider public on some of these new innovations as well. Not even new, is it really? Intercropping's been around for a while, but it's getting it out there as well to the wider public, as well as to farmers as well, on what the benefits are against the risks and what the payoffs are. And if there's also an incentive there as well, I think that will help drive uptake, particularly in the UK.
Yeah, I think I'd completely agree there. I think once we actually start to formalise and finalise things like the value of carbon, we already have markets that are beginning to emerge, but to my knowledge, the value of a tonne of carbon's not really being fixed yet. I think once that happens, and it will happen, it kind of has to happen if we want to have any chance of meeting any of our targets around, focused around climate. I think that could have a potentially huge beneficial impact for anything on farm that looks to deliver natural capital alongside nutrition. But I certainly think, going forward, it's a very different system where we will be asking a lot more of farming, and very different things that we've as compared to what we've asked of farming in the past. But when we start to do that, that's where I think that challenge and opportunity exists together. And again, particularly with things like living mulches, where I think Neil mentioned the potential to build organic matter and to build carbon in soils through roots, root exudates, and building biology. We will hopefully be able to put what will hopefully be a profitable figure on that going forward to make that sort of system stack up.
I think the question of cost of carbon links us in nicely to a question we had earlier. I don't know if any of us are going to be in a position to answer it, but I might as well pose it. Which is more expensive, the carbon cost of biological and soil nitrogen fixation, or the carbon cost of synthetic nitrogen manufacture? I think this was aimed at Neil, but might as well give it a go, if anyone knows.
That's a tricky one, I guess, yeah, particularly because you've got I get to some extent, it depends on again, as Neil's shown in some of his slides, the form of nitrogen that you're using, because they'll have very different carbon costs associated with them. And also, I guess, in the way that you're encouraging nitrogen fixation, whether you're looking to do that through something like Clover or maybe through products like biostimulants that are becoming more widely used. There may be, well, hopefully not, but there may be issues coming with regulation changing from 2022, at least in Europe. We're reviewing, I think DEFRA reviewing at the moment, how that translates through to how we use them and label them in the UK. So I think, and again, just the cost of carbon itself, and not really having pinned that down yet. I would hope that certainly through something like Clover Living Mulches, there's a cost to getting them established, but then there's, as Andrew mentioned, if they can be in place for 3 years as a sort of minimum, or potentially even longer, and you don't have to re-establish them year on year, you might be able to top them up again, as Andrew mentioned, with sort of variable rate sowing, that you've got a single cost there that comes in 1 year that hopefully then gives you a repeatable saving in terms of the amount of nitrogen that goes on. So you should, in theory, you should be able to calculate those figures, I would think, and potentially for different types of nitrogen as well, which I don't know why I don't have those figures. I don't know what those figures would be, but it would be an interesting one to do, looking at where those break-even points are according to different costs of carbon and different fertilizer types, maybe.
I think that's a fairly good attempt there, Dave. Well done. I think I'd like to brush on the on something that's come up in a few of the presentations, to be honest, and that's the question of varieties which lend themselves to use with Clover Living Mulches and with planting mixtures and intercropping more generally. Is there something to be said for that, do we think? I mean, I feel that from our experiences at STC, for example, there'd be a lot to be said for, apart from quality of the clover seed, also actually just having a variety that you know is going to perform with within your combination, because that might help mitigate some of those yield penalties. So is there more work that needs to be done in terms of breeding for traits which will lend themselves, do we think?
Well, I mean, I would say, Jen, I mean, absolutely. I don't see that there's been hardly any focus on breeding, not just clovers, but any species for this particular use. There's a huge amount of work to do there, for sure. We just have so little information, and the sort of pool that we're working in, that we're fishing in, is pretty shallow.
I mean, Dominic, I know you were saying something about heritage varieties.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm going to touch on, because David already mentioned it. I mean, sort of modern breeding's done what it set out to do in focusing on yield and focusing on monocropping. So, we're trying to use these varieties that aren't possibly suited to intercropping. And that's probably one of the key barriers, which is why I think, yes, certainly there are cereals that maybe, let's say, are less genetically improved, or the heritage wheats, for instance, that they're taller, they're deeper rooting, that are likely to perform better, or even population. So you've got genetic diversity within a wheat crop, say, that I think should be trialed. And I think that's also the beauty of taking the approach where you're doing a collective experiment with a group of farmers, because you get the option to trial these different things that the individual farmers probably can't do alone, but as a group they can learn collectively by trialing lots of different crops. So one of the farmers wanted to grow wheat. One of the farmers also wanted to try winter beans as well. So there are other options, I think, and it's about finding the most competitive crops and the most suitable variety. And there may even be a varietal thing. So we're doing a bit of work at the moment on a participatory wheat variety trial network, and one particular variety looks well suited to weed suppression. So in environments that are weedier, it tends to perform better than the control varieties. So I'm sure there is more work around finding and identifying varieties that are better suited for this kind of system.
I mean,
I agree, and I think it's because I think the oats are a very interesting one as well, where we've seen in some of these projects that oats do seem to do quite well, and we don't necessarily fully understand why yet, but it might well be that, I think, as you mentioned, Jen, some of the exudates and the sort of allelopathic interactions with weeds might help oats to perform well. I also think there's scope, and it was quite interesting that you mentioned, Dominic, that you're using a mix of different white clovers, which I think potentially looking at the how we actually design and recommend the clover mixes for the strips as well, by using more than one, gives a bit of insurance potentially. If one doesn't perform particularly well in the field, you've got the other one there too, and possibly even going beyond that to look at having more than white clover alone in a mix, just as we would do with something like the flowering field margin, where we'd look to design some sort of diversity into that in terms of the plants it contains as well.
What do we feel the role of technology is in overcoming some of the key challenges, key barriers that remain in terms of implementing intercropping and clover living mulches, or any living mulch for that matter, on a broader scale?
Take it that one's partly directed at me, Jen. Yeah. It's I think there's two quite distinct approaches. One is where essentially it's just there is a very traditional approach, if you like. I mean, we can't ignore the wisdom of ages. I mean, we have forgotten some of it. We need to relearn some of it, and Dominic sort of alluded to that a few minutes ago. So there is that, if you like, traditional approach, and that is one way forward, and it may well be an effective way forward. There is also a thorough-growing precision farming-based approach, if you like, and that it relates to a lot of the kind of strip till work that we've done, where you're using an awful lot of repeatability, true repeatability, the fact that you can almost put plant on plant. And even further on than that, now use a lot of camera work and so on to identify issues, very specific issues, deal with those issues very locally. Which way do I think it'll go? Probably, I suspect, in Western Europe, high land values, very demanding consumers. I suspect that we'll see more and more of the precision farming side, and that can be used to address some of the specific problems we've talked about. Where land values are lower, I suspect that we see a big role for the more traditional, what I'd call broadacre approach. I suspect that the precision farming will be key, but that will obviously, to some extent, I guess why I'm hesitating is because it has the potential to be exclusive, i.e. exclusive of participants, if it becomes very, very technical. That'll create opportunities for some, but the risk is that, without all the education, training and support that requires, it could be exclusive of a considerable number of farmers. But hey ho, that is kind of the way of the world at the moment.
Check if anyone else wants to chip in. Oh, looks fine. Right, well, I see that we have unfortunately rapidly run out of time. I have no idea where it's all gone, but thank you all very, very much indeed for joining us. Thank you all for putting forward your questions, and thank you very much to the panelists for what I found to be really interesting talks, to be honest. I think I've learned a lot this afternoon. So I will wish you all a very pleasant remainder of the afternoon and a very pleasant evening, and thank you again. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.
Bye.
Bye.